Let's see. So basically, as your interaction cost goes up, you're making it harder for users to complete their tasks.
Mhm,
And so you want to always think, even though it's sometimes, the types of arguments get devolved into, oh, let's just be like macOS, or let's
mhm,
just be like Windows. I think what people really are trying to say is, let's behave in a way that is consistent so that we are
mhm,
not lost. And so we have to take that into account. We have to give it that perspective. Um, and so, anyway, at the end of the day, you want to make sure that your system feels familiar, yet it's its own thing, and you want
mhm,
to balance that out. But there are certain things that basically you don't want to touch, like, for example, the way that a text link behaves,
mhm,
right? Like, you click it and you go to a place. You don't want to change that, because the moment you do, you're like the outlier, and you're very different than like 99% of the internet. And so, at, as a user experience designer, you want to think through that. And whenever we get merge requests, I try to explain that, if it's in a way breaking the rules or the guidelines, or it feels too different.
mhm,
Sometimes we are challenged on those standards and those guidelines, and that's okay. But for the most part, I try to, to explain that with a good backup, hopefully, but in a way that makes sense. So yeah, that would be reasonably, like, why we talk about familiarity and behaving like other systems
mhm.
in a Linux system.
It's a very different field, but I think it works as a comparison as well. This idea of sort of offloading that mental workload is something that applies to literature as well. Like you see a lot of these fantasy series that are very heavily inspired by like, Tolkien work, right? Where
Mhm.
you don't need to explain what these fantasy races are because you can assume that people have some sort of background knowledge on, what a hobbit is or what an elf is,
Right.
what
Yeah.
a dragon is. Like that assumption is already there, so you don't need to worry about it. And it's the same thing
And
here,
from
where you don't need to explain
Absolutely.
what a link is because if you're doing it correctly, if you're doing it the way that everyone else is, that is just assumed behavior.
Absolutely. And you want to be attentive as a user experience designer. You want to be attentive to those types of uh, conundrums,
Mm-mm.
because it's important that if you want to break a rule or a guideline in user experience, that there is really good reason for that,
Mhm.
and that the result is a better outcome than the one that is the standard,
Mhm.
right? And so, uh, a little bit of UX deals with the idea of show don't tell.
Mm.
um, so, for example, I think every now and then, we get merge requests that are like, I don't know, we're implementing a drop down, for example, that does X, Y, and Z. Uh, and it just so happens that it's a bit complicated. So we're going to add a big old paragraph right above it that says, this works like this.
Yeah.
And that is probably not the best thing, because users want to go fast. When they have to read, users want to read the least and understand the most. And so you want to either do away with the text and just leave the drop down there, or you want to work on the text or the labels in your drop down so that they're more understandable. If you're
Mm.
doing something wrong, yeah, by all means put a warning there. But if you're just going through regular use, you want to cut away from text.
Mm.
And so that's what I mean. Like, try to make sure that your UI encapsulates the social experience that you want users to have,
Mhm. Mhm.
and how fast they want to go, how easy it needs to be, how powerful the interaction needs to be, and work on that, rather than, here's all the added information that you want to watch out for before you touch one of our controls. And that most of the times leads users to step away from the system rather than dive in.
Mhm.
So yeah, users want to read less, basically.
Mm. How would you effectively use tooltips then? Because they're still a fairly common like UI
Yeah.
element.
Yeah, tooltips, well, they have a specific function, right? So their function is to have additional information about the one specific item that you're about to click.
Hmm.
Uh, and that is not the same as explain what this button does. It's
Mhm.
additional information. And sometimes we don't do a good job at this. I admit, that sometimes we say, yeah, use a tooltip so that you can explain what's going to happen. That's probably not the best approach. The best approach is usually to explain additional information. So, for example, some type of warning, some type of a little gimmick that it's important to use here.
Mhm.
Um, and you also want to make sure that your text is as short as you can,
Mhm.
because also text gets translated, and usually when text gets translated uh, to anything other than English, it gets longer, and so you also want to shorten your sentences. You want to use phrases for the most part, but the end goal of a tooltip is to use it for additional information. If there is something that the user cannot understand from the UI itself, a tooltip will not fix it. You want to work on the UI itself to make it more understandable, more part of a natural workflow for people.
Mhm. Mhm. And text is not the only way that you can portray information to the user either. I brought up the example of having your, warnings be colored a certain way, your errors be colored a certain way, so that
Mhm.
that's also something you can rely on. But I think the important thing with that is you can't just rely on that, because there are users who either are going to theme their stuff, or they might not have they might be colorblind, and those
Yeah.
colors might not, they might not be able to distinguish certain colors.
Yeah, in fact, we've been working really hard at this. We bring this up often, especially because right now at Plasma we have a goal to develop a more accessible desktop. And when we do that, um, we have this we have tried to catch those instances in the UI where we're saying, oh, we're just going to give you a red button here and you'll understand that that's a warning. And that's not always the case, right? In fact, there is a guideline in user experience that says that color alone cannot be the only piece of UI that communicates meaning to users.
Mhm.
And it's one reason why, in fact, not just in Plasma, but in other many UIs, particularly in Phone UI, where you see, even though you have a colored button, you may have an additional graphic like an icon with an
Mhm.
arrow that's telling you if you click here, this happens. Why? Because you can color the text and the arrow in different ways than the button. And that way, the user that may have trouble seeing the color blue can see at least the arrow and the label. And so you skip that idea and they get past it and they can complete the interaction they're trying to do.
Mhm.
So yes, it's really important. But also there is the whole other side with psychology of color, where you want to apply colors that mean something to people in regular life, like red for dangerous actions, blue for easy actions, green for completion, yellows or oranges for warnings and things like that. Like those things matter for the people, for the majority of people that actually can see colors without a problem. Um, but at the same time, there's been instances that we've caught where there was nothing but color,
Mm.
and we needed to work on that. And I'm sure it's going to get better. And when we talk about the design system in a few minutes, I'll tell you how we may actually have answers for that. But yeah, that exactly, you're right. Like we have to think of all of this. Honestly, at the end of the day, the role of a user experience designer is just to convey social interactions,
Mm.
but in a digital form. And what are the expectations of regular users to complete actions on a computer as they do in everyday life, like to do laundry, to do wash your dishes, to clean your house, things like that.
So, where does sound come into play with KDE? Because I know if you go back in the, a lot of early desktops in the early 2000s, late 90s, everything made a sound. There was sound
Yes.
everywhere. You can see there's someone who put a compilation together of every single sound effect from, I think, KDE 2, and I don't even know how many sound effects that desktop had. But
A
modern
product of our
desktops don't.
time, I guess.
Sorry?
a product of our time.
Mm, mm. But sound is also another thing that can also portray information, assuming you're not doing whatever was being done back then.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, sound is it's core and it's important. I think very recently, this year, we worked on our login and logout sounds, and they were revamped. And but by and large, I think over time, desktops and UIs have gone the way of silent interaction,
Mm,
and warnings are more. Uh, they're more like, very specific because they need your attention.
mm,
And one reason for that is because in today's age, with our phones, with our tablets, we're bombarded by notifications of all kinds. And to have the mind space for each of them
mm,
and give them their space is not as effective. Like, the more notifications you send, the more turned off as a user you'll be about reviewing any of them,
mm,
because it's just, it's like a feed. It's just constantly like putting out new information.
mhm,
And so I think desktops in general have tried to basically minimize the use of sound so that it actually is effective when it comes up.
mm,
So, for example, we do this very much like macOS and like Windows. When there are errors in the system, we bring that up with a sound. When we log in, we welcome the users with a sound. When we log out, we exit the place with a sound. But I think uh, those are generally the most recommended areas where sound wants to be,
mm,
because at the same time, another idea is you have to think that these spaces are personal.
mm,
And when you take your personal space, your laptop, your phone, whatever, and you go to a public space, then you are very loud, and
mm,
probably you won't be, the most pleasant person to be next to. And so there are situations that you want to mimic, and I think that that's one of those. Doesn't mean that maybe sound is not important anymore, but I think that it seems that users prefer a quieter space, a more peaceful space,
mhm,
rather than one that is constantly seeking attention.
mm,
Um, so from that regard, it makes sense. But at the same time, you also want to be very careful of omitting sounds when there should be a sound. Like, if there are important messages in the system that just sort of fly through your desk screen, and you don't do anything about it because you could have missed it, or you walked away from the computer, but you definitely needed to hear it,
mm,
then that's something that we want to look at. I don't think we've encountered situations like that, but I'm sure, our large user base will probably bring something up, and we're happy to hear that.
mhm.
So, yeah, absolutely. Like, we want to be careful how much we use it.